about that time. It's about that time to get paid.
Ain't no half-stepping.
Cool in the shade. Drink a little bit of lemonade. Let me tell you what I want. Yo.
Yeah.
So we've got the human brain, the most complex organ of the human body, and, arguably the most complex organ known to man. And then within the human brain, we have the prefrontal cortex, which sits right at the front of the brain. And this is the part of the brain that separates us from every other form of organic life on planet Earth, because this is where any information that the brain receives first begins to get processed. And then that information might flow to the cerebral cortex where it starts to be analyzed. But the initial processing of that information starts in the frontal lobe in the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is where all our conscious thoughts take place. When we consciously do things or consciously analyze information, controlling the thing we do or the things that we think with 100% awareness, all of our premeditated, mindful actions. This is all taking place in the prefrontal cortex. And most of what we do and what we think is going to be subconscious, from keeping our heart beating, blood flowing, keeping our eyes blinking, even consistently taking a breath, breathing. And the majority of our thoughts are on a subconscious level. We do a lot of these things without even thinking about it consciously, to the point where 95% of our brain's activity is unconscious, and just 5% is used for conscious thought, conscious decision making. And again, that 5% of conscious thought starts in the prefrontal cortex. And again, most of the information that we receive is going to enter the prefrontal cortex first. Just about everything is filtered through that part of the brain. Everything except sound. Sound is directly received through our temporal lobes by the primary auditory cortex, which means that sound bypasses the prefrontal cortex and enters the brain subconsciously without us being able to analyze it before finally reaching the cerebral cortex. And more specifically, melodic sounds produced with a melody or music bypass the conscious part of the brain even more, which means that these types of sounds become more easily embedded into the subconscious part of the brain, which is why a lot of times melodies are used to teach things like letters and numbers, because when things enter the brain melodically, they can leave a much stronger impression on the brain because they are being directly embedded into the subconscious, making it easier for us to memorize those things and for those things to attach to our brain. And music in general is just powerful. Music has actually been used to improve the condition of people with Alzheimer's, dementia, and all different forms of brain damage, to the point where it's actually been seen to repair damaged brain cells. You got people who have completely lost the ability to move at all, completely lost all their motor skills. And when you play music, these people are tapping their feet and even getting to the point where they are getting up on their feet and dancing. People who haven't said a word in months and years, clearly singing. So we know that melodic sound, music, is having a profound effect on the human brain. And then we've got the study of cymatics, which shows that when you play certain sounds at certain frequencies, each individual sound has its own individual effect on matter, to the point where different sounds will create different patterns within that matter. And for human beings, we know that patterns are formed on a subconscious level, and that any patterns that we form are tied to the striatum, the part of the brain that deals with the reinforcement of actions, and specifically the reinforcement of our subconscious actions, the things that we do and the actions that we take without even thinking about it. Those things that are deeply rooted and deeply wired into our brain. And the more that we do something, the more that we take something in, the more striatal pathways that are created towards that specific thing. And the different things that we do release different amounts of dopamine. And dopamine is the chemical that basically locks in those pathways toward those specific things. And different things are going to release different amounts of dopamine, higher and lower levels of dopamine. And the experience of listening to music and intaking music into the auditory cortex is actually one of the highest level of dopamine producing activities that we can engage in. And again, when that high level of dopamine is released, it creates a very strong pathway within the subconscious part of our brains that attaches our brains to whatever music we're listening to. And that attachment includes the beat, the sound, and most importantly, the lyrics. And this is why so many companies use jingles and songs to sell their products, why different music is used in trailers and things like that, because that music, that melodic sound, helps to attach those particular things to your subconscious mind, to the subconscious part of your brain. And of course, this is why music in general is so popular and is one of the most lucrative industries in the world. And of course, you got all these different forms of music all across the world, but there is no form of music more influential than hip hop. Hip hop is without question the most popular music in the world. It has dominated literally every other music genre out there. And it's pretty much morphed into something that's more than just music. It has become its own culture. And again, that culture that hip hop has created has had a massive effect and influence over society on a global scale. You can see the influence of hip hop everywhere. But of course, in the beginning, in the early days of hip hop, when this thing first started, nobody saw it becoming what it is now. When you look at hip hop in its earliest stages, everybody assumed that this thing was just a fad, that it was just going to be a flash in the pan, and that it would last a few years before finally fading away. Nobody really saw this thing as a form of music that could sustain itself. And of course, that was proven wrong on a major scale. But just how hip hop started out being seen as just a fad, it also started out as something completely different than what it is now. There is a lot of debate and a lot of theories on exactly when and how hip hop got started. But what we know for sure is that the very first person to gain some type of large amount of notoriety was DJ Kool Herc back in 1973. And we could look at DJ Kool Herc as being like the very first DJ. He's kind of like seen as the pioneer of the idea of taking a record, taking an existing record and looping that record and mixing that record and, turning it into something completely different. And while he would mix the records and play the music or jock the discs, DJ these events, you also had a guy named Coke LaRock who would get on the microphone and talk to the crowd and hype the crowd up as the music played. So you could look at Coke LaRock as the very first rapper, or what they called him at the time, an MC, the master of ceremonies. Because the whole idea behind this thing when it first started was to mix and play good music for people to dance to and to keep the crowd hype while that music was playing, keeping the ceremony or the event or the party going. But all of this stayed on a localized level in the clubs, at different events, until Sugar Hill Gang dropped the song Rapper's Delight in 1979. And with the Sugar Hill Gang, it was just like that original idea of the DJ and the MC producing music to make people feel good, to make people want to dance and to raise people's spirits. You know, you had communities filled with drugs, guns, violence. And the idea behind this music was to give people something to elevate them above those circumstances, to inject positivity into, you know, what might have been a crazy circumstance. And when Sugar Hill Gang released Rapper's Delight, it transcended that. This thing sold over 1 million copies in less than 1 month. And the popularity just kept growing until this thing sold over 14 million copies. And again, this was just uplifting, positive music. People were gravitating towards it, and it was very clear that this is what people wanted. And with each and every song after that, we would just get more of the same from Sugar Hill Gang. Positive, uplifting, fun music that people just continue to gravitate towards. These guys put out 4 albums from 1980 to 1984, and you could not find one explicit lyric, one word of profanity on any one of these 4 albums. But the music was selling millions of copies, and it was clear that this is what people wanted. And during this time, during the beginning stages of hip hop, this is what hip hop was. You know, no super deep lyrics, nothing really complex, but it was consistently positive and consistently uplifting. It consistently stayed on that positive vibe, on that positive wave. But, you know, there was like subtle things that pointed to the power this thing had to embed deeper messages, like the Sugar Hill Gang depicting themselves as Egyptians and Native Americans in their only 2 music videos. And remember, these are the very first 2 hip hop videos. You know, the music is simplistic and fun, but even within all that simplicity, they're still making these subtle statements, even taking the Egyptian theme all the way to their album cover. And this is where early on, the idea of hip hop really began to start to show itself, because you got those 2 words, hip hop. Now, according to a lot of the people that were around during this time, the term hip hop was actually a derogatory term against this form of music. You know, people would call it hip hop as an insult. But when you really break this term down, it seems like there's something more to it. Because when you look at that term hip, it can mean to have understanding and awareness. And when people use the word hip back, you know, during this time in the 70s, it basically meant that you were aware of what was going on, that you understood what was happening, and, you know, basically had a full grasp on whatever that particular thing is. You know, you were hip to what was going on. So basically being hip was being consciously aware. And then you match that up with the word hop, which is referring to something making you move, you know, something making you dance. And you got hip hop, a form of music that is keeping you consciously aware while also making you move, making you dance. And as hip hop continued to grow, you could really start to see that this is what it was about. Because right after the Sugar Hill Gang, we got Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five.